What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got the Bloodzu Necro, an absolute tank of a force when it comes to the Blood Surge ability and being able to utilize the minions with this at the same time to not necessarily use them for damage, but also use them for damage in a weird way. Considering we are using the Death Speaker's Pendant, every time that we utilize Blood Surge, they get a little mini Nova off of them, which may not seem like it's going to be having that much damage, but it can be a noticeable increase, and there's a few aspects to this necklace that do end up helping this build and synergizing with it to really make it shine. And effectively, one of the biggest things about this build is it creates that phase tank capability, where not only are we able to basically eat all of the damage, but we're also able to take the life force from all the enemies around us and be able to utilize that to fortify ourselves and dish out massive amounts of damage to them, no matter how many different strikes they may throw upon us. That is the best thing about this build. This is effectively what I've been looking for out of a Blood build since the beginning of the game. I always wanted it to be just one of those kind of like super tanky, get in the face of all the enemies, vampirically basically siphon all of their life force and then explode with damage outward. And you'll notice from the gameplay footage on screen right now, that's effectively what we're doing. Massive amounts of numbers here, but there is a way to synergize this to really get us into the position to where we're constantly able to basically hit with critical overpowers. That's where our real massive amounts of damage are going to come from. And one thing to clarify about the build early on is this is not going to be the best for all types of content. More specifically, this isn't going to be the best when it comes to boss fights. You're still going to be able to survive boss fights. You're going to be tanky in those boss fights, and you can kill bosses. It just may be a bit slower, as some of the aspects to really capitalize on massive amounts of damage output from this are going to be from large crowds of enemies, as we're going to be gaining primary resource in those moments, and at the same time utilizing blood orbs to constantly reproc our capability of casting an overpower. And with those two things working in tandem with some of the other legendary aspects from this build are going to be the way that we are basically like clearing massive crowds of enemies and having that massive amount of basically survivability from this build. But it's overall a good bit of fun, basically like a massive fireworks show on the screen in certain moments. It's just like strobing blood everywhere and an army of the dead with blood, just like blood waves, or a better version of what you would think the actual ultimate skill blood wave would be, where we're just like tides of blood rolling in as us with the minions coming in and just drowning out every bit of these enemies with blood waves, or blood surges, if you will. It's a good time, but we've got more than a few things to cover, so let's jump straight into the gear. Now, when it comes to the gear, we're effectively going to be working with more than a few pieces of item that may benefit us later on in the version of like running through higher tier dungeons. More specifically, the two items that are really focused on to start making this build and basically building around these two items to create this build were the Death Speaker's Pendant. That way we're getting these little mini Novas off of each one of our minions every time I cast a Blood Surge, and on top of that, the Blood Moon Breaches, which causes our minions to possibly have a chance to cast a curse onto any enemy they hit. And at the same time, the biggest thing about this is any enemy that is afflicted by one of our curses is going to take 70% multiplicative increase to their overpower damage. And on top of that, I'd arguably say, like, you really want these pants for this build. We're going to get a massive damage increase out of Blood Surge from just these pants specifically. The pendant is something you could find later on to just kind of help out with a bit more damage. But the big thing about the pendant is just essence cost reduction and fully increasing the capability of our increase to blood damage overall while being healthy. But with these pants, we're getting maximum life damage reduction, and on top of that, amplified damage, which is going to turn into a 20% multiplicative across the board all damage increase from just having any curse on an enemy. So not only are we getting massive increase to our overpower damage, but we're getting massive damage increase from just maximum life and just having that amplified damage from just cursing any enemy. And on top of that, utilizing the curse with this build is going to create us a massive cooldown reduction, massive damage reduction as well from any enemy, and slowing every one of the enemies at the same time. There's a whole lot of synergies working in with this build, but these pants really are something that you really want to throw into this to really amplify that damage output from Blood Surge itself. But that being said, let's start off with the helmet. We've got the Occult Dominion on here as a legendary aspect. That way we're increasing our Skeletal Mages by 2, as I already talked about with the Blood Moon Breaches. Since the Skeletal Mages basically kind of hang out in the background, constantly just kind of throwing some what little frost balls right now is basically what they're doing. I wanted 2 more of them to possibly cast those curses on enemies. At the same time, since they're working with frost, they can freeze those enemies, helping with a little bit of that survivability. And on top of that, our skeletal mages are gaining primary resource back for us at the same point. So having 2 additional is just more primary resource we're getting back every time that we're fighting or in the middle of those large packs. So that's going to help us with casting those blood surges. On top of that, the rolls that we're looking for with the helmet, 100% total armor is the number one thing we want to look for, as with this build, we don't have a necklace or pants that can further increase our total armor percent, so we're really going to need to rely on the helmet and the chest piece for total armor increase, which we definitely need, and try and get that roll as high as you can. Beyond that, maximum life would be really great. Any resistances, anything that's going to help us mitigate any type of damage and just get to that maximum point of resistances. And at the same time, if we can get all of those resistances maxed out to where that we don't need any gems inside of our rings or amulets, it's just even more armor that we can slot in to help with that survivability as we push into higher tier dungeons. And trust me, when it comes to 70, 80 tiers, I mean, we're pretty much getting to the point where we're almost invincible with a build like this, as long as you know how to utilize it. Or at least as long as you can cast Blood Surge at the same time and keep that Fortify up. It is pretty much unstoppable. But moving on to our chest piece, we've got the Protector on this one, creating a bit more survivability, since we're basically face tanking in the face of, we're face tanking enemies everywhere we go. We're jumping into the middle of the crowd, middle of elites, eating all that damage and then siphoning their life force and then exploding it outward. We want a little bit more of that barrier just to guarantee ourselves, especially in higher tiers, with that survivability, just giving us a bit more protection. And again, total armor is going to be the number one thing we'd like to have with this, as we just need to guarantee that we have enough armor for that damage reduction as we push into higher tiers. And anything beyond that, maximum life would be great. Damage reduction while fortified, anything that's going to give us a bit more survivability. Intelligence is something that will give us a bit more damage output, but at the same time, it's not something that's absolutely necessary for a chest piece. Moving on to the gloves. Right now I'm using Frostburns, but I would say this is not an absolute necessary. This is something that can synergize really well with the build, but you do not have to have these for it to work out really well. I did not need these. This was just something I kind of played with and ended up really liking it as a combination, or that just was a nice little cherry on top to give a little bit more survivability, as we are proccing Lucky Hit quite often with Blood Surges, and how many times we're able to cast it with the attack speed increase for it, as we'll talk about with the legendary aspect a little bit later on. But the number one things is it gives us attack speed, it gives us a bit more of that critical strike chance, and you'll notice I got a terrible roll on this one. I wish this was much higher. It would be even more beneficial for me. But at the same time, the number one thing is that Lucky Hit chance to get that primary resource back. That is ultimately the number one thing we'd want on some gloves, but at the same time, we're getting Lucky Hit chance to possibly freeze enemies. And since we're using the cold mages, they're freezing, we've got a lot of freeze going on here. It just creates an atmosphere to where we can even more comfortably sit in the pack of enemies, especially if we're capable of freezing them and stopping them from dealing damage. But if you don't have the Frostburns, arguably, at first I was using something that had critical strike chance and overpower damage with the Blood Surge on top of that, with ranks and attack speed, and this worked out nicely, but it just didn't give me what I truly needed, which was, once I got to this one over here and the legendary aspect of Blood Getters, increasing the Skeletal Warriors by 2, it was nice, but it's not necessary. It's a little bit more damage, maybe a little bit more survivability, as there's 2 more of those Skeletal Warriors to kind of take the aggro, but it's definitely not as good as accelerating Primal, which every time that we're critically striking, which we're critically striking quite often with Blood Surge, this is going to amplify our attack speed. And if you have that in combination with that Lucky Hit chance to get that primary resource, there are going to be some moments where, ideally the perfect gloves for me would be overpower damage, Lucky Hit chance, critical strike chance, and that Lucky Hit for primary resource. The number one is that gain that primary resource Lucky Hit chance, since it is proccing quite often for this build. And it gives us, in certain moments, almost infinite capability of just casting Blood Surge as many times as we possibly can. And you top that off with that critical strike with core skills, increasing our overall attack speed, it gets kind of insane how quickly we are dishing out damage and how quickly we're just putting more blood surges out there, to the point where we're getting so many different overpowers, so many different critical strikes, so many different moments of a lucky hit proccing, considering it's an AoE spell. It gets a bit ridiculous. That's just one of the reasons why I say this is much better for pack density areas where we're going against large packs, and it's not great against boss units. We're going more towards really hitting a large amount of enemies with that AoE and really proccing based off of the amount of enemies we're hitting, instead of just like that one boss unit and hoping for that lucky hit chance on that. But moving on from that point over to the Blood Moon Breaches, we talked about this one earlier. These are going to be something that I would say are almost definitely needed once you get into the higher tier of Nightmare Dungeons, as it just further increases our overall survivability with a little bit of that damage reduction, maximum life, but overall damage output is increased by a massive amount with these for our blood surges, our overpower, and just overall damage output. Now, if you don't have the Blood Moon Breaches, you could go with something like, you know, consuming a corpse gives us a blood orb. I have not thrown this into the build as we don't need it. Blood orbs are going to be coming from us using the corpse tendrils a lot of times. But if you're looking for any type of pants and you don't have the Blood Moon Breaches and you want more survivability, the number one thing, total armor, damage reduction, resistances, and I believe that's pretty much about it that I'd look for pants. But ultimately, I would try to target farm for those Blood Moon Breaches to really get the meaty damage from this build. You will be able to probably get the same amount of survivability, the same amount of attack speed, but you may not have that massive critical overpower damage that you'd get from something like Blood Moon Breaches, giving us that 70% multiplicative damage to overpower. That really does amplify that damage output. But moving on to our boots, we've got Cold Bringers on this. Now, this is not absolutely necessary. This is something that I kind of just worked in to play a bit more into that zoo aspect of the build, working with the minions, trying to get more utility out of them, and getting a bit more of the possibility of that 6% chance to apply a curse to happen. At first, I was using Iron Maiden with this. It was free. It was something that I thought I would be able to generate essence through that. Ended up switching to Decrepify because it works so much better in the synergy aspect of it. But at the same time, this is another one of those things that can kind of help with survivability in a moment where it could cause enemies to get frozen. We've got other things raining down on them. It gives the capability of, just in case you may have run into a pack, you've applied your curse and you started casting Blood Surge, and then maybe more enemies came in, but you didn't apply that curse. Maybe this could help in that moment. But arguably, if you're really looking for a bit more survivability, you could trade the Occult to Minion, throw that off there, throw it onto the boots, and then put Disobedience on the helmet. I didn't try that. This has worked in the tier 100 as this build right here, but that may be something that fully enhances the survivability to a point where you could get a whole lot more out of it. You could tank a lot more damage, especially with how fast we're casting some of these blood surges. The amount of times that we're hitting with it, especially in an AoE radius, you might be able to get that max stack of Disobedience within 1 second almost out of the 4 seconds it'll be applied. That actually might work out a whole lot better. I haven't tried it personally, but that would be a good replacement in this aspect if you just felt like the Blizzard wasn't doing a whole lot. This was just something that I thought would work really well with it, possibly amplify a little bit of the damage output as we're going to be chilling. So if you had something like Crowd Control, amplified damage, or one of those rolls on any other aspect, it would be, or any of the other piece of gears, it would be something that would be beneficial for us. But that's where I went with that. When it comes to the boots, overall, number one thing is movement speed, a little bit of resistance. One thing that I would love to have rolled on here is essence cost reduction. That actually would be something that would be huge for us and give us even more capability of putting out more blood surges over time and relying less on those moments where we need massive amounts of regen of resource. It would just make it even better in a way. But also, another thing that I'd really like on top of this would be additional evades. That would be huge for us, as we will have that Juggernaut aspect on a different piece of gear that does increase our overall cooldown by 100%. I was able to work with just the one evade with 75% movement speed, but I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of moments where it would be even better if I had 3 capable evades in certain moments. And it would just help out even more with that moment with Juggernaut having that 100% increase. But moving on from there, we've got the main hand weapon, which we want a wand every time. As with wands, we are statically going to get an increase to our lucky hit chance. So with this one upgraded to level 5, we've got a static increase of 15% every time we put on a wand. So we want to make sure that every time that we're striking with Blood Surge, we're getting as high a possible chance as we can to get those lucky hits to proc. But with that, we're working with the Bloodbathe, which is Blood Surge's Nova, echoes again, dealing, sadly enough, 50% less damage. We can get this little lower if we had it on a necklace or a two-handed weapon, but as far as I'm concerned, it works out perfectly with this. I would ideally like this to be at 50% instead of 53%, but we're getting basically everything out of this that we want from it, and at the same time, it does cause an echo with the mini Blood Surges. And I'm not sure whether or not they get halved in damage, but at the same point, there are certain moments where it's like 50,000 damage per one of those mini novas based on the overpower from Blood Moon Breaches and the increase to how many enemies that are hit by that from the Death Speaker's Pendant. So in moments, you know, with just the 4 skeletal warriors with you, you know, they'll be in the middle of the crowd with you at the same time doing their AoE damage. You could have like another 250,000 from the first initial Blood Surge, and then that mini nova after could be an additional 100 to 150,000 possibly, and that's not including your massive Blood Surge damage on top of that. So you can see how it kind of synergizes in that way to really amplify the total amount of damage we're getting in those moments when we're casting Blood Surge and we're in the middle of those massive packs of enemies. But when it comes to the overall rolls that we want from a wand, Overpower damage is the number one, you know, core skill damage, just further amplifying Blood Surge. Damage to slowed is going to work out really well for this build, considering we are using Decrepify, so pretty much everything we're cursing is going to be slowed. We're using Corpse Tendrils with this, which is also slowing. Another thing that would be, you know, better for synergy besides damage to injured enemies could possibly be like crowd control damage or more critical strike damage, since we are trying to go for critical overpowers that can just further amplify those moments. And we do get critical strikes quite often with this build, with how many times we're proccing that Blood Surge or how many times it's casting from the increase to attack speed from certain aspects. So it gets a little bit ridiculous. You know, you may have seen it in that gameplay footage at the beginning of the video. There are moments where it's just like yellow numbers all across the screen, just like blinding almost in a point. But that can help out in those aspects. But damage to injured can be beneficial for us. I wish it was a little bit of a higher roll, as it can be that moment that just truly amplifies that damage at a point that would possibly help us in boss fights, but even more so when it comes to just dwindling that last bit of health on certain enemies when we're in elite packs. But moving on from there, we've got a shield for our offhand. We want a little bit more of that survivability. That way we've got more of that block damage reduction. We've got a little bit of block chance on top of that. And we want the Juggernaut aspect with this, as you'll notice I have 9,000 armor right now with just the two, the helmet and the chest plate, giving us that total armor increase. Sadly enough, or I guess not really sadly enough, it's just weird. Every time you put the Juggernaut aspect on a piece of gear, you won't notice the increase to your total armor until you're inside of a dungeon or out inside of the world. I think in total I had 16,000 once we're in a dungeon with this Juggernaut aspect of 4,000 on top of the 9,000, which is well more than enough what we need for the tier 100. I believe 13,000 is like the cap limit of how much damage reduction you can get from a tier 100. So as long as you're around that point, if not a little bit above, that's going to be extremely beneficial for us. But with this addition, it puts us over the top, giving us enough of that damage reduction at the cost of, sadly enough, the 100% increase to the cooldown, which is definitely noticeable with evade. I would highly suggest having some boots that have multiple evade stacks, so that way you're not always just caught up in that moment of waiting on that evade cooldown, because in some moments it can be like a lifetime before you get that next evade, and it would be a huge benefit to have it available in certain moments, especially with a build like this. If you have one of those moments where lucky hit doesn't proc and you don't have the capability of casting more Blood Surges, you definitely want to get out of dodge real quick, since we're in the middle of the entire pack of enemies. When it comes to the rolls that we're looking for on a shield, we want maximum life. Maximum minion life is beneficial in a way, as, you know, once again, something like tier 100, they can be a bit squishy, more specifically the skeletal mages, but not often are they going to be immediately in that line of fire unless you're just like basically bum rushing through and they're getting caught up by enemies. But in general, maximum life and damage reduction for yourself is probably the #1 thing you'd really want to look for. I'm not sure if it's possible, but essence cost reduction, I believe that may only be on focuses though. I'm not sure about on shields, but if that's possible to drop on there as a roll, that would be hugely beneficial as well. If you can get that on the boots, the necklace, and the shield, super. I mean, that'd be huge at the capability of how many times you could cast Blood Surge, especially with the resource regen. It would just make it absolutely insane. But those are the things that we'd be looking for, you know, damage reduction while fortified, maximum life, utmost #1, as it's just going to further increase our overall damage output. But maximum minion life is one of those things that's not absolutely necessary, but it can be beneficial for us. Now, moving on to the necklace, we've got the Death Speaker's Pendant. Obviously, this is going to be one that's just going to give us a little bit more of that damage output, but the big thing about this, I'm not sure whether or not summoning skill damage fully increases the overall damage output of the skeletal mages by a large amount, but it did seem a little bit noticeable at the beginning that they seem to be killing a bit quicker with their frost attacks in when I first started with the build. Later on, as I kind of like reworked my Paragon tree, they seemed a little bit less damaging, but I was kind of surprised at the damage output that seemed better than the damage output I had from a previous build where I was maximizing everything about the minions. So it was a little bit surprising, but the #1 thing from this is the blood skill damage, the essence cost reduction, and the coalesced blood increase. That's giving us, I believe, a total of 36% multiplicative damage from blood skills based on just being healthy. That's going to be huge for us, and just having every one of our minions have another additional mini Nova coming out, which is going to be even more beneficial or more noticeable when we've got those skeletal warriors with us in the middle of that pack and giving us even more of that AoE, the lucky hit proc chances, and just more chances to amplify our overall damage output from every blood surge we cast with overpowers or critical overpowers. But that essence cost reduction is huge. I would highly suggest, if you had a necklace, you know, if you didn't have the Death Speaker's Pendant, or if you just wanted to throw that one off entirely, you know, you could arguably still work this build without it. You know, blood skill damage, total armor, tides of blood, or coalesced blood, either one's going to work out really well for you. But the #1 thing, you know, if you didn't have this one, you could have more damage output from your initial blood surges. I feel like it's a little bit better having it from, you know, all sources casting a blood surge in certain moments, especially when you have like poison enchanted enemies. There can be times where it's really hard to push in and try to survive, considering poison damage is still as broken as it possibly can be. But in those moments, being able to kind of be at a distance and still get a little bit of that damage from your minions can be beneficial. But overall, if you don't have it, you could go with a necklace that just further increases your capable output of blood surge damage, and on top of that, more total armor, bit more survivability. But #1 thing I would say is you really want to look for something that's going to increase or decrease your cost of essence when it comes to your skills. That way we can really spam out those blood surges as we're going through. There's one thing that I forgot to mention as I was talking about the gear, and this one legendary aspect called Untimely Death. Now, this is something that can further increase your overall damage output for this build. This may even be something that can help with those boss fight moments. It may be a necklace that you could basically have in the inventory for those moments to pull out and then slot in when you're facing off with a boss in a nightmare dungeon, or just doing the boss content in the overworld. This may be enough to get that 90% multiplicative damage increase to really give you that shining moment to make boss fights a little bit quicker. I completely forgot about this, but this is definitely something to further increase your overall damage output, especially if you don't have Death Speaker's Pendant, or if you just wanted to have another necklace in the offhand, basically, in your stash to slot in for those moments when you're going for a single target, to just really amplify those moments of damage that you'll have. But that being said, let's now move on to the skill tree. Now, moving on to our first ring. Ultimately, when it comes to our rings, we really want to increase our overall critical strike chance. You know, #1 thing is we're trying to make critical overpowers here to just really amplify the total damage output, especially every time that we overpower, considering we're not going to be overpowering all the time, but when we do overpower, we want like the meatiest amount of damage we can out of those moments, and it's going to be noticeable once we have everything working in synergy. But with my first ring, the thing that we're going through is the Rothma's Chosen aspect, or Circle of Rothma's Chosen. This one is going to amplify our overall attack speed by a massive amount. It gets crazy the amount of blood surges we start to be able to pump out, especially if you've got this working with that critical strike chance from accelerating primal. I mean, it gets insane how many times you are casting blood surge and how quickly the echoes coming out right after that. And you'll notice that it's proccing lucky hit on primary resource coming back. It's proccing the critical strikes. It's getting like insane. Both of those working in tandem is beautiful for running through 70s or 80s. It makes it so much faster. It's absolutely insane. I'd almost argue, you know, take the Frostburns out if you're going through 70s or 80s. Frostburns is just going to be even more beneficial for running through something like a 90 plus, as it's just going to create a little bit more survivability in certain moments where you need less of those enemies attacking you, even though as long as you're able to cast that blood surge, you know, you're effectively being able to tank every bit of their damage by siphoning their life force. But it gets absolutely insane with that full increase of like 75% attack speed. And if you got some gloves with even more attack speed on it, I mean, it's absurd. Now with your rings, obviously we do want maximum life on top of that. Maximum minion life, you know, it's there. It could be beneficial. You know, you don't absolutely need it. One thing that I would say would be a great benefit to this build is lucky hit chance. If I can get rings with both critical strike chance and lucky hit chance on them, it would just make it even better of a build. But we do want a little bit of that critical strike damage on our rings, as we need to amplify the amount that we're dealing when we get those critical overpowers. Moving on to the next ring, we've got Grasping Bangs for this. This is another one that's going to give us even further increase to our overall capability of having those critical strikes, as we get 17%. And on top of that, even more of that multiplicative critical strike damage for when we do critically overpower. Now with this ring, I did end up getting damage to slowed, fortify generation, the overpower damage, and sadly enough, not the max roll for critical strike chance, but a pretty decently high one. Now, fortified generation, I wouldn't say is absolutely necessary for this. This is just one of the rings I was working with that was going to benefit me with having more of that overpower damage and a good bit more of that critical strike chance. I tried to roll the next one to be lucky hit chance, but ended up, you know, you get to those points where you're starting to chunk 2 million every time that you're re-rolling. It's like, ooh, let's stop dipping into our pockets too much. But damage to slowed is going to work just fine. But ultimately, like a perfect roll on these would be critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, maybe overpower and critical strike damage, but at the same time something along the lines of you know, maximum life is going to be just as beneficial on top of that, because that's just even more damage. Obviously, you know, if I had maximum life on both of these, that's another damage increase that we can't just, something we just don't want to ignore. You know, you definitely want as much damage as you can possibly get out of this. But that's going to be the gear right here. All right, let's move over to the skill tree. And when it comes to the skill tree, we're going to start off with Hemorrhage, as Hemorrhage is also not only going to be something that further increases our survivability by gaining us a little bit of Fortify back, but every time we're going to be grabbing up a lot of blood orbs, so anytime that we have to utilize Hemorrhage to gain essence back, it is going to be a massive amount of essence. Like within less than a second to a full second, we're gaining either half to 75% of our total essence back in some of those moments. It's actually ridiculous how much additional essence we get anytime that we touch a blood orb and then have to utilize this. So in any moment that we may not having that proccing moment for, you know, lucky hit to gain that primary resource back, or the skeletal mages may not be there or possibly generating enough for us as we're constantly spamming that blood surge, this is going to be another one of those ways that we can regain really quickly and dish out that blood surge to the point where we're capable of eviscerating whatever enemies that we may be surrounded by. But up next, you know, Blood Surge, 5 points into that. Make sure that we go over to the left for Paranormal Blood Surge. That way, anytime, or we're just gaining more possible chances to have an overpower stack up. You know, if any enemy damaged by Blood Surge Nova while you're healthy, they gain 1 stack of Overwhelming Blood. When you have 5 stacks of Overwhelming Blood, your next Blood Surge is going to overpower. And since we have that further increase to the amount of times, you know, our attack speed's going up, the amount of times our blood surge is going out, especially with the primary resource coming back, we're able to just basically hold that right click the entire time, and it is just spamming a massive amounts of blood surges out. So we're constantly getting overpowers, and the way that we're going to be able to synergize with that at the same time is by utilizing the blood orbs, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. On top of that, we do want Hewed Flesh, as this is just going to create corpses on the ground for us to be able to be capable of utilizing for either just pulling minions back or possibly also using corpse tendrils. And if we do end up utilizing this for a boss fight, especially if you're in like a regular nightmare dungeon, you're going to need this to be able to have those moments for corpse tendrils to get that amplified amount of damage. But moving on from that, we have Blood Mist. We want to move over to the left side for Ghastly Blood. You don't necessarily have to have this, but this can be beneficial for us, as it's one of those aspects that we can use to basically come into a room, drop or go into Blood Mist, drop those corpses, and then kind of like float on out away from the enemies, trying to do it as quickly as possible, considering for whatever reason, you know, they hinder our movement speed while we're inside of this. I really wish they would completely eliminate this aspect from Blood Mist, since it's our only unstoppable skill. It makes no sense that I need a legendary aspect to basically move freely while in Blood Mist. It's extremely stupid, considering about the only great thing about Blood Mist is it can basically almost save me, considering there's an animation right before when we go into Blood Mist that we can still get killed in. So there's a lot of problems around the one aspect of basically creating a bit of survivability skill for us, and at the end point it ends up being utilized as something as more of a utility skill than it is something that's actually beneficial for us for getting out of dodge or possibly being able to create a bit more survivability in a way. It's just a bit of clunkiness to it, but we will be able to utilize Blood Mist a whole lot more, considering every time that we overpower, it's going to reduce the cooldown by 2 seconds, and trust me, Corpse Tendrils and Blood Mist are almost going to be in full synergy of full cooldown consistently as we're utilizing this build with large packs of enemies. But moving on from that skill to Warrior Mastery, just to give them a bit more life. It's not for the damage, it's just so they survive. Moving on down to the bottom portion, or the curse skills, we've got Death's Embrace. This is going to create a bit more survivability for ourselves and give us a little bit more of that damage output by 6% multiplicatively for our blood surges, since we are going to be right on top of enemies. We also want to put 3 points into amplified damage, and from the Blood Moon Breaches, we're getting an additional 2 for that, giving us to a total of 20% multiplicative increase to damage. And we want Decrepify, as not only is this going to create a little bit more survivability for us, but at the same time it's going to slow those enemies, increasing our overall damage output. And on top of that, we go for the lucky hit chance to proc a decrease to our cooldowns by 1 second, which is going to proc ridiculous amount of times. I mean, it's almost, in certain instances, Corpse Tendrils up and Blood Mist is up, but that just depends on how quickly you can overpower at the same time, if you can have both of those skills up. But Corpse Tendrils will be basically off of cooldown almost immediately every time that you're capable of casting Blood Surge after cursing these enemies with Decrepify. But on top of that, we've got Skeletal Mage Mastery, further increasing their overall life, and then we get the entire blood tree basically filled out over here, gaining 30% more from all healing sources. We're getting the lucky hit chance to proc for blood orbs to spawn in. We're getting multiplicative increase to our overpower damage by 15% while we're healthy, and it's doubled while we're healthy, so we get 30% multiplicatively while we're healthy, which is quite often. Coalesce Blood just gives us 36% multiplicatively increased by just being healthy, and on top of that, gaining lucky hit to fortify, which is going to be very noticeable. We will be able to proc this quite often. This is one of the ways that we're going to be able to actually fortify ourselves. Once I get into the Paragon tree, you'll see we're not using some of the other glyphs that are going to give us the fortify. This is going to basically be one of the main ways that we fortify, and it ends up working out really well for us. But on top of that, we want Corpse Tendrils, and we want to make sure that we go for Blighted Corpse Tendrils. That way, every time that we're pulling in these enemies, we have that 35% chance to drop a Blood Orb, which, trust me, there's going to be some packs of enemies. There's so many of them, we're almost going to have like 10 to possibly 20 Blood Orbs in certain instances, and with how many times that we're capable of basically having this off of cooldown and being able to cast it multiple times, there's going to be a ton of Blood Orbs, and we're going to be able to utilize that to constantly have the capability of overpowering, and it's going to be massive damage numbers from that. But moving on down to the last portion with the ultimate skills, we will not be taking any of the ultimate skills. They are garbage for the most part. Even Bone Storm really isn't the most beneficial. But Inspiring Leader is going to further increase our attack speed and our minions' attack speed. But the number one thing is just increasing our overall attack speed by 12% while we're healthy. But on top of that, we want Death's Defense. That way we can further increase the armor and increase resistances for our minions. That way they have a bit more survivability. and 2 points into bonded in essence. That way we can maintain the maximum life of our skeletons every time that we're raising that skeletal priest. And on top of that, the cherry on top, the Rothma's Vigor. That way every 12 seconds we have the capable chance of overpowering, but this is where we start to synergize with the blood orbs. As you'll notice, this timer is reduced by 2 seconds each time that we get a blood orb to heal us or overheal us by almost 8,000 life, which is going to proc quite often. And in those moments when we use corpse tendrils, we're right in the middle of where that corpse is. We're casting Blood Surge, and then we've got Blood Mist off of cooldown. Go into Blood Mist, we're able to consume those blood orbs, and then come back around into the crowd and immediately have the capability of Blood Surging to automatically start having that overpower damage and critical overpower on top of that. And we can keep utilizing that same method, so we're decrepifying, we're effectively, we're coming in, corpse tendriling, sitting there, casting as many blood surges as we possibly can, going into Blood Mist, coming back around, eating some of those blood orbs, coming back out, hitting decrepify, hitting corpse tendrils, blood surging, and then rinse and repeat. And we're having this massive damage cycle, and we're just dishing it out insanely fast with the every time that we're overpowering, having that massive attack speed increase. It gets to be a bit insane. But let's talk about the Book of the Dead. Now, with the Skeletal Warriors, I am using the Defenders. That way they're capable of just basically surviving. I have every 6 seconds your Skeletal Defenders completely, no damage taken in those moments, and that way they're just able to survive and cast those mini novas and kind of tank a little bit of the damage, take a little bit of the aggro. Skeletal Mages, we are working with the cold aspect. Each time your cold mages damage an enemy with their primary attack, you gain 2 essence. We've got 5 of them, so 5 times 2, we're getting 10 essence every time that they strike with one of those balls, and you notice they're just speedily taking those out, and they have that further increased attack speed while we're healthy, and we've got attack speed increased on them based on the skill tree or the Paragon boards and other aspects, so it just makes it a really nice way to also just capitalize on that essence regen. On top of that, with Golem, we're actually going with the Iron Golem. That way we're just multiplicatively increasing our critical strike damage, just further synergizing with those critical overpowers. And just anytime that we do critically strike, trying to make it as much damage as possible if we aren't hitting that overpower at the same time. We could do a maximum life by 10% multiplicatively. Honestly, it's not bad. We could also go with the attack speed. Any one of these 3 is going to be beneficial for this build. I honestly couldn't tell you which one's going to be the best in bet or the best in slot for this build, but I figured since we're already dipping so much into maximum life, since we're already dipping so much into the overall amount of overpower damage, and we already have a massive amount of attack speed, those little bits on top with the 10% aren't going to matter as much as that 30% multiplicative to our overall damage output, especially when it comes to a critical overpower. So that's why I went with the Iron Golem sacrifice on this one. But now let's move into the Paragon tree. Now when it comes to the Paragon tree, it's going to be pretty simple off the bat. Over to our right, we will gain that 20% damage increase with maximum life. We do want to go with as much maximum life as possible to get as much survivability, but then over to the left, also gaining that maximum life with resistance to all elements. Move up to the glyph. Our first glyph socket is going to be territorial. That way, since we're going to be base tanking every enemy inside of this game, we want damage to close enemies, but we also want specifically the damage reduction against close enemies. That's going to give us a little bit more of that survivability, and I absolutely needed this in order to push into tier 100, as there was just so many different moments where, without this, I was not having the maximum capability of sustaining that overall life in certain instances, especially in that last room in vaults. You really need as much damage reduction as you possibly can have in order to really have that face tank capability at that moment. But moving over to the left, we also do want to grab up that 20% damage just to amplify ourselves a little bit more when it comes to each blood surge. But over on the right, we definitely want to make sure that we grab up that 200 armor over here. Moving on to the next board. Then moving on to the Cult Leader, which is just going to give us a little bit more damage output. Probably don't absolutely necessarily need this one. I'd almost argue you might be able to just kind of like throw this one out, delete this whole chain right here, and move up through the right to make sure that you get the actual Skeletal Warrior's armor. and then start pushing up, as one of the biggest things that we really want to grab out of this portion of the Paragon boards is the minion attack speed. That's going to be the number one thing that for skeletal mages is going to regain a lot of that primary resource for us and just give us the capability of freezing those enemies a bit quicker. But overall, it's attack speed and the resistances, armor, and maximum minion life that we're going to be going for with this Paragon board. And then moving over to our glyph socket, we're going to be working with the mage one that just further increases all minions' overall increased resistance to all elements by 35%, just giving them more survivability, and over to the right, creating more damage reduction for them on top of that. So that way they just have really good survivability overall. And up at the top, a little bit of minion damage. We don't necessarily need it, but we're going to be passing by this node anyways to move on to the next Paragon board. The next Paragon board that we're actually going to be playing around with is Bloodbath, just further increasing the total amount of overpower damage that we're going to be dishing out with this one. We're going to first head up over to the right to make sure that we grab up that damage while fortified, getting more of that maximum life, and then heading over to gain that 35% multiplicative damage for overpower damage. Heading up over to the right to make sure that we get more damage while fortified and fortified generation. On top of that, over to the left, we get damage while healthy, but the big thing is more overpower damage over here, so we want to grab that up. Then heading back over, we need to head over to the glyph socket over here, and we need to make sure that we put in Dominate, which is going to give us a further increase to our overall damage of Overpower anytime that we utilize it. So getting a 12% multiplicative on top of just every 5 willpower, getting another 39%, which we're up to 229% from this one glyph socket right here for just overpower damage, which is a bit ridiculous, but it's definitely noticeable. And down below that, we do get, you know, some bits of healing received. Sadly enough, I'm just going through this. Honestly, I wouldn't grab the healing received. I would more than likely try to avoid this and go for the one over here on the left that's damage to fortified. I wish I didn't have to move through that just to get a bit more overpower damage, but it's definitely one of those moments where I want all of that willpower as much as possible to enhance this glyph's overpower damage increase. But moving up from that, we'll be heading over to the left and to our last and final board, which is going to be, what is it, the Blood Begets Blood. That way, every time that we're grabbing up one of those blood orbs, we're getting a multiplicative increase of 5% up to a 15% for 5 seconds every time that we have that blood orb, or consuming those blood orbs, which we're going to be consuming quite a lot of them, and more than 5 at a lot of given moments, especially with large packs of enemies. So we're pretty much going to have that 15% multiplicative up every time that we're critically overpowering, or just overpowering, or dealing damage in general. But moving over to the left, we want to grab up that 90% increase to our overpower damage on top of 10% damage increase. And then moving along the left side, heading over to the glyph socket, we want to get Undaunted, as this is going to give us more damage while fortified, which we're pretty much always going to be fortified. But the biggest thing is another 10% damage reduction the more fortified that we have. So not only is it's one of those moments with Fortify, once you become fortified, once you have that massive shield around your health bar and you're fully maxed out on Fortify, that's going to be 10% damage reduction on its own right there. So now we'll have an additional 10% on top of that we'll be gaining from just this glyph socket at the same time to give us just even more of that survivability. But that's going to be the Paragon boards right there. You can play around with this one. I wouldn't say this is like the end-all be-all version of this. There's more than likely a few points that you could probably take out some of these, maybe even minion resistance over here on the left, and just keep the damage reduction. Possibly even take out the cult leader entirely, and I'd probably keep the minion maximum life and armor over here, and then just head up over this right side and just kind of slowly do this, and maybe try to possibly branch out further to get another glyph socket. That would be more than likely something I would say would be a good idea, if you can probably work that in by taking a few of these nodes out from the minions board right here with the cult leader. But beyond that, the rest of it is really going to be beneficial for you. That's about the only thing I could think to actually improve upon these Paragon boards that I just haven't played around with. You know, we're getting closer to Helldivers 2 over here, so I will be transitioning off this, trying to kind of move through these builds as I just try to have a good bit of fun with the Season 3, considering the content hasn't been exactly the most exciting thing, but since I haven't played since Season 1, this has been a good time playing around with some of these builds that have been improved upon since the launch of the game, which I will say has been making it an overall pleasant experience for me in Season 3, even though if I had been playing every day since launch, it probably would be a droll addition when it comes to this season for me. But that being said, let's get into some gameplay and kind of give you the rundown on how the playstyle actually functions. We won't be going into a tier 100, but we'll be going into, I believe, a tier 70, just kind of give a comfortable attitude with it. And I'm going to not roll through the entire thing. I'm just going to kind of give you a rundown on how to utilize it in the best way and showcase how to use the skills in combination to get the most synergy out of it and the most damage out of it in order to make it function as tankily as possible and as massive damage as possible. Alright guys, we're in the Vault of Copper. We're here at tier 80. Wasn't, you know, I went for, you know, one of those 71 to 80s and then it just popped out an 80, so let's just show how casual an 80 can be with this build at level 100. I guess we'll get a couple of these. We'll immediately come in, hit Blood Mist, so we can drop a couple of those corpses. We're going to make sure we get that barrier guy in close. We'll curse and then just start spamming that damage out. We'll hit the corpse tendrils again, pull everything in, start spamming again, grab up those blood orbs, come over here, spam it out again, hit the corpse tendrils in there, hit the blood mist to get a little bit of repositioning right here, curse again, and then just melt. Now sadly enough, we're not having a massive pack right here, but you'll notice like the damage numbers are insane. We're constantly able to just proc. Let's move in here real quick, hit the corpse tendrils, pull everything in, hit the curse, and then just start melting again. It is absolutely insane how much damage and how long we're able to sustain actually just constantly channeling Blood Surge at this point. It's just a good time. I love the playstyle. You know, we'll make sure our minions are nice and healthy, and then we'll just keep moving in. Hit with another one of those blood mists. It's nice to have that blizzard though. It really does slow down the enemies, stops us from just being overwhelmed almost instantly. You'll notice how quickly we're able to just get back to 12 stacks. Now, one thing to keep in mind is both Hemorrhage and Blood Mist can basically utilize this 12 stack right here. So you do want to make sure that when you're going into a group, if you want to like be certain that you're about to get that moment where you're guaranteeing the first strike with Blood Surge is going to overpower, you want to make sure that you don't use Hemorrhage or Blood Mist. But with the playstyle, we are still able to guarantee through the use of blood orbs another overpower really quickly right after we've basically pulled everything in with corpse tendrils. But again, we'll have one of those moments. You'll notice right now we're basically getting all the overpower from that one skill right now. We'll hit this. We'll be able to tank some of that damage. We'll go into Blood Mist after casting that the corpse tendrils to pull everything in, and then as soon as we come out, after we grabbed up all those blood orbs, we're instantly overpowering and absolutely melting. It's insane. I love this playstyle. It's just a phase tank coming in and just blowing every bit of these enemies out of the water. Sadly enough, isn't the greatest against bosses, you know, but even in certain instances, you can just come in and just curse the enemies and then start hitting with Blood Surge, and you should be fine in that same manner. But let's make sure they're healthy and keep pushing forward. Like an 80 is just super casual right now. We'll be able to go and do Blood Mist, pull everything in, curse it again, and just melt it away. And then we'll be able to just keep pushing forward. Now let's just kind of try to speed run this in a way. We'll come in, pop in this, go into corpse tendrils, pull everything in, melt it up. You know, you'll notice in that moment it was just basically like critical strike city. We weren't getting the overpower just yet because we didn't have the 12 stack, but it then soon went into the overpower from just how many times that we were hitting with Blood Surge and gaining that proc from its passive ability. Pull everything in, curse it again, just go back into it. Then we'll be able to just go into Blood Mist really quickly, come back out, immediately curse, and then start casting Blood Surge. Sometimes it's better to immediately have that moment where we hit Corpse Tendrils first, move out of the Poison. Poison Enchant is going to be a pain for this build, I'll tell you right now. But luckily enough, we'll be able to cast it again, and lucky at the same time with the Death Speaker's Pendant, we can get that overpowered damage on top of the mini novas, and they can do substantial damage, especially considering we've got the Blood Moon Breaches doing that 70% multiplicative increase, 20% increase to damage from the amplified curse. or amplified damage from the curses. So it does get to be a bit noticeable in certain moments where those little mini novas are doing a substantial amount of damage themselves, even capable of basically finishing off those elites that we just had on the other side. Let's keep on pushing real quick. So we'll just pull in everything and then just melt city. Then come on over here. We're at 8 stacks right now, and then just immediately just melting everything around us. Keep on pushing. Sadly enough, we still need that little key for this one. So we'll move on around. Realistically, we can just kind of like push through here with no worries almost. Like speed running with this build is quite easy. Like look how much damage reduction we have. We're basically not taking anything. This is tier 80 right here. Everything that's touching us is barely damaging us. This poison over here is a bit damaging. You know, we want to make sure that we basically pull everything in over here, come in, just massive melting power right there. And then we'll pull everything in again. We just grabbed some of those blood orbs. We've got another overpower, critical overpowers right there. It's just insane. Just melt it up. We'll keep on moving over here, grab this up. And yeah, it looks like skeletal mages have died. They're the weaker ones in this, but that's because we were basically just pushing through right there. But we'll come back, we'll just raise them back up, and we've got another way to just generate more resource at the same time from those lucky hits. So compounding everything together is really the best bet at just maintaining almost like an infinite blood surge resource regen, recast moment, if you will. But we'll just curse everything, melt it up, make sure that we heal the minions, make sure that we're constantly casting that blood surge to maintain maximum fortify, maximum health, you know, because no matter what, we still can die if we allow these enemies to strike us more than once. We're still going to have those squishy moments, but now let's just kind of sit in the middle. What we're going to do is just utilize corpse tendrils, pull everything in, hit everything again. Going to grab up a couple of those blood orbs, pull everything in again, just melt city, curse. I forgot the curse, that's why it didn't instantly kill. So we're going to go into blood mist real quick. We're going to hit that. Then immediately we pulled everything in again. We're going to go back into blood mist. Generally, the rule of thumb is to hit corpse tendrils and then blood mist. Right now, I'm in a bit of a dangerous situation, but we're still super tanky. With that one, I hit corpse tendrils first, come out, and then instantly melt. And then, I mean, we're done right there. Like, even though I messed up a little bit, we were still pretty much fine. Like, I had a moment where, since we've made it so tanky, we were able to just maintain in that moment of messing up right there. But it just makes the last room super casual. If you're looking for 925, I mean, you know, I honestly had been running 70s to make this super casual, but an 80, I'd almost argue 80 to 90. You could probably just run through them really as quickly as that. It just really showcases how simple the build is and how much fun it can be. Just especially once I was pushing into 100, you know, the moments when you're getting beat down by some oh my god, two uniques. Okay, we'll have to check out that here in a moment, but you'll see. Let's hold on. So let's look at what these are real quick. I'm sorry, I'm a loot fiend and I must know what we've ended up getting. Blood Artisan's Cuirass, Ring of Midland at 925. Oh, max roll and lucky hit chance. Not a max roll and thorns though. Any attack speed, things like that. Low roll, yeah. You know, it's all right. They're all right. I thought they were going to be better. But that's going to be the Blood Zoo Necro build right there. Arguably one of my new favorite builds. It's tanky. We're able to just bum rush in. We're getting massive amounts of damage. It may not be the greatest when it comes to boss units, but when it comes to just clearing nightmare dungeons and having that playstyle that's just fun to be able to just push on through, have maximum survivability, and just crush everything around you, and just like a fireworks show on screen. Like, it's just visually pleasing every time, just seeing massive numbers, just blowing everything up around you, just exploding, and just massive blood wave. It's a good time overall. But hopefully you've enjoyed this. Hopefully this might be, you know, something you'll be working towards either this season or maybe future seasons. Hopefully, you know, Blizzard gets it together and kind of works a little bit more towards the blood surge type of things, you know, maybe gives us a little bit more damage with blood surge. I don't know, but hopefully they do end up giving us a little bit more damage with it. You know, overall, I think this build is doing barely fine, but there are just moments where it's not perfect for eviscerating a boss unit. Like, we do still have those overpower moments, but without the blood orbs, without the possibility of just spawning those in or possibly taking out, you know, you could put in the consuming a corpse gives you the 30% chance to have that blood orb spawn out, but at the same time, you need multiple blood orbs, and it's just not a high enough proc chance to get massive amounts of blood orbs. You will be getting them from that lucky hit chance, and I believe that may be the one way to further increase that for boss fights, but at the same time, waiting on those moments to have that overpower, to have that massive amount of damage, it just works out better when you're facing off against massive amounts of enemies. So clearing nightmare dungeons with this is like its most effective route. And if you're working with a group, you know, even better. You know, it's one of those moments where you're going to have that full-on survivability that you need. You know, solo Necro can be easy at times, but when you start stacking up the amount of people with you and the damage and the health of those enemies gets to be bigger and bigger in a 4-man group, this is one of those builds that can kind of compensate in one of those moments to where maybe you don't have enough damage to completely eviscerate all the enemies, especially if you got some teammates that are, you know, lacking in the damage department. This can kind of help in one of those moments. But it's overall just one that I found to be extremely fun. But if you'd like to see more of this content, you know, hit that subscribe button. We'll be doing more Necro in the future and more classes in the future as we progress through the seasons. I will be coming back for the Gauntlet to kind of check that one out, even though I will be jumping into Helldivers too. But if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be streaming daily. Plenty of different games coming up in the future. So if you're interested, we've got a lot of content coming this year, and we're going to be pumping a lot of it out. Different builds, different games. Whole lot of information. But on that note, hopefully you've enjoyed and have a good one.